On a bustling Thursday afternoon at Burton's Market, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maria Rodriguez rhythmically scanned groceries at her register. She had mastered the perfect balance of efficiency and friendliness over her 10 years of service, greeting each customer with a warm smile while keeping the line moving smoothly. The store smelled of fresh bread from the bakery section, and the gentle beeping of scanners created a familiar symphony of suburban shopping. Maria noticed an elderly woman approaching her register, pushing a cart filled with carefully selected produce and what looked like ingredients for a pie. The woman wore a pressed floral dress and clutched her leather purse tightly, her eyes narrowing as she drew closer to the checkout counter. Something in her expression made Maria's heart skip a beat. She had seen that look before. "Good afternoon," Maria greeted warmly, reaching for the first item. Her voice carried the slight musical lilt that came from growing up in a bilingual household, though her English was impeccable. The woman's response came like a slap. "I'd want someone else to check me out," the elderly customer announced loudly, her voice cutting through the ambient store noise. "Someone who speaks proper English. I can't understand a word she's saying." Several heads turned in their direction, and Maria felt heat rising in her cheeks. The young mother behind the elderly woman audibly gasped, pulling her child closer. A businessman in a wrinkled suit suddenly became very interested in his phone, while a teenager with bright blue hair stared openly, mouth agape. The uncomfortable shuffling of feet and awkward coughs created a thick tension in the air. Maria's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them steady as she continued scanning items. She had faced prejudice before, but it never got easier. Each beep of the scanner seemed to echo in her ears as she tried to maintain her professional demeanor. She thought of her father's words. "Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you carry yourself." From the corner of her eye, she noticed her supervisor, James Chen, watching from the customer service desk. She caught his attention with a subtle glance, their practiced signal for assistance. James had implemented this system after noticing how certain customers would sometimes treat his diverse staff. He put down his clipboard and began making his way over, his face calm but determined. The elderly woman, oblivious to the approaching supervisor, continued her tirade. "In my day, people who came to this country learned to speak properly. I can't understand a word she's saying with that accent." The irony of her complaint, given that Maria had only spoken 4 clear words to her, seemed lost on the woman. What the angry customer didn't know was that Maria had graduated top of her class in communications, spoke 3 languages fluently, and helped teach English at the local community center on weekends. She had chosen to stay at Burton's Market because she loved the community, most of whom had become like family over the years. As James approached, he noticed something in the woman's features that gave him pause. A familiar set to her jaw, a certain look in her eyes that reminded him of his own grandmother. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about her early days in America, about her own struggles with prejudice and fear. This recognition didn't excuse the woman's behavior, but it helped shape how he would handle the situation. The tension at Register 3 had become a silent drama that the whole store seemed to be watching. Regular customers who knew Maria were shaking their heads in disapproval. Mrs. Lee, who came in every Thursday for her weekly shopping, had stopped arranging her cart items to watch, her face a mix of concern and indignation for her favorite cashier. In those few moments before James reached the register, a whole community seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this increasingly common scene would play out. But what happened next would become a story that Burton's Market employees would tell for years to come. A small moment that would spark an unexpected change in their community. James walked up to Register 3 with measured steps, his store keys jingling softly at his belt. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his hair that had started graying early, just like his father's. He remembers how his dad, despite running a successful restaurant, would sometimes get customers who'd refuse to believe he was the owner. "Good afternoon," James said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people naturally want to listen. I couldn't help but overhear there's some concern here. He positioned himself not behind the register, but right beside Maria, making it clear where he stood, both literally and figuratively. The elderly woman seemed slightly taken aback by his presence, but quickly recovered. "Yes, there is," she said, lifting her chin. "I simply asked for someone who speaks proper English. I have a right to understand who's serving me." Her hands clutched her purse tighter, knuckles turning white. James smiled, not the practiced smile of customer service, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. "Well, you're in luck today. Maria here is actually one of our most experienced cashiers. She's been training our new staff for the past 5 years." He paused, then added with a touch of gentle humor, "In fact, she's so good at her job that I'd love to have her teach me her techniques. Would you mind if we did that right now?" The unexpected response caught the woman off guard. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing without words coming out. Behind her, several customers exchanged knowing looks, some even hiding small smiles. The teenager with blue hair had stopped pretending to look at the candy display and was now openly watching with interest. What?" The woman stammered, clearly thrown off script. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went in her experience. "You see," James continued, his voice warm and conversational, "Maria has this amazing way of connecting with customers. Just last week, she helped Mrs. Thompson find the perfect ingredients for her grandson's allergy-friendly birthday cake. Spent her lunch break writing down the recipe too." He started scanning items alongside Maria, his movements deliberately slower than her practiced efficiency. A deep voice spoke up from the line. "She helped me find my reading glasses when I dropped them in the cereal aisle last month." It was an older gentleman in a veteran's cap, who until now had been silently watching the scene unfold. Spent a good 10 minutes looking, even though her break had started. The elderly woman's expression began to shift, the hardness in her eyes softening just a fraction. She watched as Maria continued working, her movements quick and precise, each item handled with care. The screen showed the running total, each price clearly displayed, each coupon efficiently processed. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "my grandmother used to tell me stories about when she first came to this country. She was so afraid of going shopping because her English wasn't perfect. Said she practiced saying hello and thank you 100 times in the mirror each morning." He noticed the woman's hands relax their grip on her purse, just slightly. Maria, who had been quiet but poised throughout the exchange, spoke up softly. "My grandmother did the same thing. She used to bring a little notebook everywhere, writing down words she didn't know so she could look them up later." Something flickered across the elderly woman's face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. The store seemed quieter now, as if everyone was holding their breath, watching this small moment of connection bloom in the most unexpected place. The tension in the air began to dissolve, replaced by something else. Not quite comfort, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone that change, real change, often happens in the smallest of ways, in the most ordinary of places, like Register 3 of a neighborhood grocery store on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. The elderly woman's shoulders relaxed slightly as she watched Maria carefully bag her groceries, making sure the eggs stayed on top and the fresh produce didn't get crushed. Each movement was practiced, thoughtful, the kind of care that comes from years of experience and genuine concern for others. "You know," the woman said suddenly, her voice softer than before, "my neighborhood has changed so much." She wasn't looking at anyone in particular, her eyes focused on something distant, perhaps memories of streets and faces from years ago. "The bakery where I used to get my bread closed last year. Even the library has all these new computers now. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong anymore." A young mother in line, bouncing a fussy baby on her hip, nodded sympathetically. "Change is hard," she said. "When we moved here last year, I was so lost. but Maria helped me find a local moms group that meets at the coffee shop next door. Now I have friends I can count on. The store's usual background noise, the hum of freezers, beeping of scanners, squeaking of cartwheels, seemed to fade as more voices joined in. An older man mentioned how Maria had helped him figure out his grocery store rewards app. A college student talked about the time she was short on cash, and Maria quietly covered the difference for her milk and bread. As these stories flowed, the elderly woman's face softened further. She looked at Maria with new eyes, seeing not just a cashier, but a person who had woven herself into the fabric of the community. Someone who, like her own children and grandchildren, was building a life, making connections, creating a home. I may have been too hasty, the woman admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She fumbled with her purse, pulling out her wallet with slightly shaking hands. My daughter always tells me I jump to conclusions too quickly. Maria smiled warmly as she handed over the receipt. Would you like help out to your car? She offered, the same way she'd done thousands of times before, for countless customers. The woman hesitated, then nodded. As they walked to the parking lot, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt, the woman mentioned her struggle with arthritis. Maria listened, sharing how her own mother found relief with gentle swimming exercises at the community center, the same center where she volunteered teaching English on weekends. You teach English? The woman asked, surprise evident in her voice. They had reached her car, a well-maintained older model that probably held years of grocery trips and family memories. Yes, mostly to older adults who want to feel more confident in their daily lives. Maria explained, loading the bags into the trunk. Actually, we're always looking for more volunteers. Sometimes people just need someone to practice conversation with. The woman stood there for a moment, keys in hand, seeming to wrestle with something internal. Finally, she spoke. My Thursday afternoons are usually free, she said, almost shyly. If you think I could help. Back inside, James watched through the store window as the two women exchanged contact information in the parking lot. He smiled, thinking about how life has a way of turning moments of conflict into opportunities for connection. The next week, the elderly woman returned to Burton's Market. She chose Register 3, where Maria greeted her by name. They chatted about the English class they'd both attended the day before, about recipes and grandchildren, about belonging and community. Other customers smiled, witnessing the small miracle of what happened when people chose to build bridges instead of walls. And so, Register 3 became more than just a checkout line. It became a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest shifts in perspective, that every interaction carries the potential for transformation, and that in the end, we're all just people trying to find our place in a changing world. As word spread through the neighborhood about what happened at Burton's Market that day, something unexpected began to take shape. The story traveled from checkout lines to coffee shops, from school pickup zones to community bulletin boards. It wasn't just about a confrontation that turned into a connection. It became about how one moment could spark a bigger change. The following Tuesday, during the store's weekly staff meeting, James stood before his employees with an idea that had been keeping him up at night. The break room was cramped, filled with the scent of coffee and morning pastries, as workers from all shifts squeezed in to hear what their supervisor had to say. What happened last week got me thinking, James began, leaning against the break room's worn counter. Every person who walks through those doors has a story. Some are dealing with loss, others with loneliness. Some are struggling to find their place in a community that keeps changing. He paused, looking around at the faces of his diverse staff. Maybe we can do more than just sell groceries. Maria, who was sitting near the window where morning light streamed in, spoke up. The English classes at the community center are getting bigger every week. More people are coming, not just to learn, but to connect. She smiled, thinking of her newest student, the elderly woman who had once rejected her service. A young stock boy raised his hand hesitantly. My grandmother barely leaves her apartment anymore, he shared. Says she doesn't feel like she belongs in the neighborhood since all the old shops changed. But she still comes here because it's familiar. Ideas started flowing around the room like a gentle current. Someone suggested setting up a small seating area near the in-store coffee counter where people could gather. Another proposed hosting monthly community dinners in the parking lot during summer evenings. A cashier mentioned teaching basic smartphone skills to older customers who struggled with digital coupons. James watched as his staff, people who had sometimes felt divided by their different backgrounds, came together over their shared vision. The energy in the room was palpable, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. That evening, after the meeting, Maria stayed late to help set up what would become known as the community corner. A cozy nook near the store's entrance with comfortable chairs, a small bookshelf, and a bulletin board for local news and events. She arranged the chairs in a welcoming circle, imagining the conversations that might happen there. As she worked, the elderly woman from last week came in for her evening shopping. She paused at the entrance, noticing the changes. "What's all this?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Maria explained the new initiative, watching as the woman's eyes lit up. "You know," the woman said thoughtfully, "I used to run a book club in my living room years ago. Always thought about starting it up again." And just like that, another seed was planted. The simple act of making space for connection was already beginning to bear fruit. The woman jotted down her idea on the fresh community board, her handwriting slightly shaky but determined. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the store windows, more customers stopped to look at the new space. A young mother reading the bulletin board discovered a neighbor who could teach her to sew. An elderly man found information about local delivery services he didn't know existed. Small connections were forming, like delicate threads weaving people together. That night, as Maria locked up the store, she couldn't help but smile at how much had changed in just a few days. What had started as a moment of tension had transformed into something beautiful. A reminder that sometimes the best changes come from the hardest moments, and that every person has the power to turn conflict into connection. The lights of Burton's Market dimmed, but the promise of what tomorrow would bring glowed brightly in the hearts of those who had witnessed this transformation. Sometimes, the biggest changes start in the smallest places, like Register 3 of a neighborhood grocery store. As summer crept closer, Burton's Market's community corner began to buzz with activity. The once empty corner had become the heart of the neighborhood, filled with the warm chatter of people who might never have met otherwise. The elderly woman's book club was in full swing, meeting every Wednesday afternoon between the quiet hours of 2 and 4. Today, they sat discussing a novel about immigrants in the 1920s, their conversation drifting between the story on the pages and their own family histories. The woman who had once demanded a different cashier now sat next to Maria's mother, who had joined the group after Maria mentioned her love of reading. "You know," the elderly woman said, holding her paper cup of store-provided coffee, "my grandmother came through Ellis Island with nothing but a suitcase and a recipe book. I still have that book, though the pages are falling apart now." Her voice carried a hint of emotion, something between pride and nostalgia. Maria's mother nodded, understanding reflecting in her eyes. "In my family, we carried our recipes in our hearts," she shared. "When I first came here, cooking those familiar dishes was like having a piece of home with me." The other book club members leaned in, drawn by the authenticity of the moment. Meanwhile, at Register 3, James was teaching a group of older customers how to use the store's new digital coupon system. His patience was matched by their determination to learn, their laughter echoing through the aisles as they celebrated small victories over technology. "Look at that!" exclaimed a gentleman in a worn denim jacket, his face lighting up as he successfully scanned his first digital coupon. "My granddaughter won't believe I did this on my own." The pride in his voice was contagious, making everyone around him smile. The community corner's bulletin board had become a tapestry of connection. Handwritten notes offered everything from gardening tips to carpooling arrangements. A retired teacher posted a free math tutoring. A young couple advertised their new home repair service. Each note represented a thread in the growing web of community support. Even the store's layout had subtly shifted to accommodate this new reality. The aisles near the community corner were wider now, making room for people who stopped to chat. The coffee counter had expanded, offering a place for neighbors to linger over affordable cups of coffee and conversation. One particularly memorable afternoon, a young man rushed in, clearly distressed. His grandmother had fallen ill, and he didn't know how to make the soup she always prepared when family members were sick. Without hesitation, 3 elderly shoppers gathered around him in the community corner, sharing their own recipes and wisdom. The scene caught the attention of a local newspaper reporter who happened to be shopping. She watched as these strangers came together, sharing not just recipes but stories and support. The young man left with more than ingredients. He carried with him the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this community. As the day wound down, Maria watched from her register as the book club members gathered their belongings, making plans for next week's meeting. The elderly woman caught her eye and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that bore no resemblance to their first encounter. In the store's office, James updated the community events calendar. Besides the book club, there were now computer classes, cooking demonstrations, and a weekly gathering for new parents. What had started as a response to a difficult situation had grown into something none of them could have predicted. A delivery driver, dropping off the evening's bread shipment, paused to read the bulletin board. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "I've been delivering to stores all over the city for 15 years. Never seen anything quite like this." The simple comment captured what everyone felt but couldn't quite put into words. Burton's Market had become more than a store. It had become a place where differences dissolved over shared stories, where loneliness found comfort in connection, and where a community remembered how to be neighbors again. As the summer evening light filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over the community corner, it was clear that the biggest changes often come from the smallest beginnings, even from a moment that could have torn people apart, but instead brought them together. One rainy Tuesday morning, Burton's Market buzzed with unusual excitement. The store was preparing for its first community dinner, an idea that had grown from a simple suggestion into a full-blown event. The parking lot had been transformed with rented tents, strings of warm lights, and long tables borrowed from the local church. Inside, the store hummed with preparation. The elderly woman who had once caused such a stir at Register 3 now stood in the produce section, carefully selecting vegetables for her grandmother's secret recipe soup. She worked alongside Maria's mother, their hands moving in the practiced rhythm of experienced cooks as they shared stories about family gatherings from their own childhoods. "In my village," Maria's mother said, chopping carrots with swift precision, "we didn't have much, but everyone brought what they could to community meals. Some brought food, others brought music or stories." She paused, smiling at a memory. Those were the nights nobody felt like a stranger. The young stockboy who had spoken about his grandmother at that first staff meeting weeks ago had brought her to help with preparations. She sat at a table in the community corner, teaching younger women how to fold napkins into elegant shapes, her fingers moving with an artist's grace as she demonstrated each fold. "My mother taught me this," she explained, her eyes bright with purpose. She always said a beautiful table makes people feel special. Around her, women of different ages and backgrounds listened intently, their own hands mimicking her movements, creating small works of art from simple paper napkins. James moved through the store, checking on various preparations, but found himself repeatedly drawn to the scene in the community corner. He watched as people who might never have spoken to each other just months ago now worked side by side, sharing laughs and stories as they prepared for the evening ahead. The local baker, who had started supplying fresh bread to the store after his own shop closed, arrived with boxes of still warm rolls. On the house, he insisted when James tried to pay. This community has given me back something more valuable than money. He glanced around at the busy scene, nodding with satisfaction. As afternoon approached, the rain cleared, leaving behind that special freshness that comes after a summer shower. The parking lot puddles reflected the string lights being tested for the evening, creating tiny mirrors of light on the wet asphalt. Volunteers began setting up chairs and tables under the tents, their movements choreographed by shared purpose. A group of teenagers, initially drafted by their parents to help, found themselves caught up in the spirit of the event. They created handmade welcome signs, their artistic efforts transforming simple cardboard into colorful displays of community spirit. One girl used her phone to create a playlist for the evening, carefully selecting songs that would appeal to all generations. The elderly women's book club members had taken charge of decorating the tables, incorporating elements from different cultures and traditions. Mason jars filled with wildflowers sat alongside elegant borrowed vases, creating an eclectic but somehow perfect arrangement that reflected the diverse community they'd become. In the store's kitchen area, cooking aromas began to blend. Italian marinara sauce simmered next to trays of Mexican enchiladas, while American apple pies cooled beside Indian curry. Each dish came with a story, a piece of family history shared willingly with neighbors who were quickly becoming friends. Maria, taking a brief break from helping in the kitchen, stood at her register watching it all unfold. She remembered that tense day that had started everything, how a moment of conflict had somehow opened the door to all of this. The memory no longer held any bitterness. It had been transformed, like so much else in their community. A young mother came through her line, buying last-minute ingredients for her contribution to the dinner. Her little girl proudly announced, "We're making my great-grandma's special cake." The recipe card she clutched was worn with age and love, bearing the marks of generations of family bakers. As the afternoon sun began to sink, casting long shadows through the store windows, the transformation was nearly complete. Burton's Market was no longer just a store preparing for a community dinner. It had become a living example of how shared food, shared stories, and shared purpose could bridge any divide. One rainy Tuesday morning, Burton's Market buzzed with unusual excitement. The store was preparing for its first community dinner, an idea that had grown from a simple suggestion into a full-blown event. The parking lot had been transformed with rented tents, strings of warm lights, and long tables borrowed from the local church. Inside, the store hummed with preparation. The elderly woman who had once caused such a stir at Register 3 now stood in the produce section, carefully selecting vegetables for her grandmother's secret recipe soup. She worked alongside Maria's mother, their hands moving in the practiced rhythm of experienced cooks as they shared stories about family gatherings from their own childhoods. "In my village," Maria's mother said, chopping carrots with swift precision. "We didn't have much, but everyone brought what they could to community meals. Some brought food, others brought music or stories." She paused, smiling at a memory. Those were the nights nobody felt like a stranger. The young stockboy who had spoken about his grandmother at that first staff meeting weeks ago had brought her to help with preparations. She sat at a table in the community corner, teaching younger women how to fold napkins into elegant shapes, her fingers moving with an artist's grace as she demonstrated each fold. "My mother taught me this," she explained, her eyes bright with purpose. "She always said a beautiful table makes people feel special." Around her, women of different ages and backgrounds listened intently, their own hands mimicking her movements, creating small works of art from simple paper napkins. James moved through the store, checking on various preparations, but found himself repeatedly drawn to the scene in the community corner. He watched as people who might never have spoken to each other just months ago now worked side by side, sharing laughs and stories as they prepared for the evening ahead. The local baker, who had started supplying fresh bread to the store after his own shop closed, arrived with boxes of still warm rolls. On the house, he insisted when James tried to pay, "This community has given me back something more valuable than money." He glanced around at the busy scene, nodding with satisfaction. As afternoon approached, the rain cleared, leaving behind that special freshness that comes after a summer shower. The parking lot puddles reflected the string lights being tested for the evening, creating tiny mirrors of light on the wet asphalt. Volunteers began setting up chairs and tables under the tents, their movements choreographed by shared purpose. A group of teenagers, initially drafted by their parents to help, found themselves caught up in the spirit of the event. They created handmade welcome signs, their artistic efforts transforming simple cardboard into colorful displays of community spirit. One girl used her phone to create a playlist for the evening, carefully selecting songs that would appeal to all generations. The elderly woman's book club members had taken charge of decorating the tables, incorporating elements from different cultures and traditions. Mason jars filled with wildflowers sat alongside elegant borrowed vases, creating an eclectic but somehow perfect arrangement that reflected the diverse community they'd become. In the store's kitchen area, cooking aromas began to blend. Italian marinara sauce simmered next to trays of Mexican enchiladas, while American apple pies cooled beside Indian curry. Each dish came with a story, a piece of family history shared willingly with neighbors who were quickly becoming friends. Maria, taking a brief break from helping in the kitchen, stood at her register watching it all unfold. She remembered that tense day that had started everything, how a moment of conflict had somehow opened the door to all of this. The memory no longer held any bitterness. It had been transformed, like so much else in their community. A young mother came through her line, buying last-minute ingredients for her contribution to the dinner. Her little girl proudly announced, "We're making my great-grandma's special cake." The recipe card she clutched was worn with age and love, bearing the marks of generations of family bakers. As the afternoon sun began to sink, casting long shadows through the store windows, the transformation was nearly complete. Burton's Market was no longer just a store preparing for a community dinner. It had become a living example of how shared food, shared stories, and shared purpose could bridge any divide. As summer turned to autumn, the changes at Burton's Market had spread far beyond its walls. The local newspaper's story about the community dinner had caught the attention of other neighborhoods, and soon store managers from across the city began visiting, eager to learn how a simple grocery store had transformed into a hub of community connection. James found himself giving informal tours, showing visitors the community corner where the book club was now so large it had split into two groups. "It's not about the space," he would explain, watching as elderly residents helped young mothers entertain their children while they shopped. "It's about making room for people to connect." The elderly woman who had sparked this transformation had become something of a local legend. She now spent 3 afternoons a week at the store, helping newcomers feel welcome, and sharing her own story with humility and grace. "I was wrong," she would tell them, her voice soft but clear. "And being wrong turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me." One crisp October morning, a city council member stopped by, drawn by the stories she'd heard. She found seniors getting computer help from high school students in the community corner, while nearby, a group of new immigrants practiced English with retired teachers. The sight brought tears to her eyes. "This is what community looks like," she whispered to James. "Not just people sharing space, but people sharing lives." She watched as Maria helped an elderly man find his favorite tea, which had been moved to a lower shelf so he could reach it more easily. The store's layout had evolved naturally over time. Aisles were wider to allow for spontaneous conversations, chairs appeared in corners where people tended to gather, and the bulletin board had grown to cover an entire wall. Each notice told a story. "Free babysitting in exchange for cooking lessons. Looking for someone to teach me my grandmother's language. Walking group for seniors. All speeds welcome." That afternoon, a young couple who had recently moved to the neighborhood stood reading the notices. The woman was expecting their first child and feeling overwhelmed in a new city. An elderly shopper noticed them and stopped. Within minutes, she had connected them with the store's informal parent support network. When I had my first baby, the elderly shopper told them, I thought I had to do everything alone. Now I know better. We all do better when we help each other. The young couple left with more than groceries. They left with phone numbers, resources, and the beginning of a support system. In the store's break room, James pinned up a photo from the community dinner. It showed people of all ages and backgrounds sharing food and laughter under the string lights. Next to it, he placed the original newspaper article about the store's transformation. The contrast between then and now told a powerful story of change. Maria, taking her lunch break, studied the photos. Sometimes I think about that day, she said quietly. How something that could have pushed us further apart ended up bringing us all together. James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves across the parking lot where the community dinner had taken place. A young girl chased them, laughing, while her grandmother watched from a bench that had been installed near the entrance. The bench had a small plaque that read, "Where strangers become neighbors." The store's regular customers had developed their own rhythms and routines. The book club members did their shopping on Wednesdays after their meetings. The computer class participants came early on Thursday mornings when the store was quieter. The young mothers met on Friday afternoons, their children playing together in the supervised kids' corner while they shopped and chatted. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the most subtle. The way people now moved through the store with unhurried steps, greeting each other by name, stopping to chat, offering help without being asked. The grocery store had become more than a place to buy food. It had become a place where community happened naturally, one small interaction at a time. As the day drew to a close, the setting sun painted the store windows in warm gold, and the community corner hummed with the gentle sounds of people sharing their lives. It was a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, and that every day brings new opportunities to turn strangers into neighbors. 1 year after that fateful day at Register 3, Burton's Market prepared to celebrate what they called their community anniversary. The store had been transformed, not just physically, but in spirit, and the upcoming celebration would honor how far they'd come. The elderly woman and Maria stood together at the entrance, hanging a handmade banner that read, "One community, many stories." Their friendship, which had begun from such an unlikely moment, now seemed as natural as breathing. They worked in comfortable silence, each thinking about the journey that had brought them here. You know, the woman said suddenly, adjusting a corner of the banner, I almost didn't come back to the store after that first day. I was so ashamed. She turned to Maria with eyes full of emotion. Now I can't imagine my life without this place, without all of you. Inside, the community corner had been expanded one final time. Photos lined the walls, snapshots from the community dinner, the book club meetings, the computer classes, and countless small moments of connection. Each image told part of the story of their transformation. The young stockboy's grandmother sat in her usual spot, teaching a group of children how to make paper cranes. These will be part of our celebration display, she explained, her weathered hands guiding tiny fingers through the folds. Each crane represents a wish for our community. James walked through the store, remembering how it used to be. The narrow aisles had given way to open spaces where people could gather. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer ones that made everyone feel more at home. Even the sound was different, filled with conversation and laughter instead of just the beeping of registers. The local baker, whose bread had become a store staple, arrived with a special delivery. A massive celebration cake decorated with landmarks from the neighborhood. This one's from my heart, he said, carefully setting it down. Just like this community, it's got a little bit of everything in it. Throughout the day, people dropped by to add their own touches to the celebration preparations. The teenagers who had created the playlist for the first community dinner came with an updated version, this time including songs suggested by seniors from their computer classes. Music brings people together, they explained, no matter what language you speak. Maria's mother organized the potluck table, making sure there was space for every dish that would arrive tomorrow. Each empty spot had a card waiting, ready to tell the story behind the food that would fill it. Every recipe has a history, she told a young couple watching her work. When we share our food, we share our hearts. As evening approached, the reporter who had first covered their story returned. She walked through the store, noting all the changes since her last visit. But what caught her attention most was how people moved through the space, not like customers in a store, but like family members in a shared home. The city council member who had visited months ago came back too, this time with news. Other stores in the city were starting their own community programs, inspired by what had happened at Burton's Market. "You've started a movement," she told James, "one that's spreading kindness across our city." Near closing time, everyone gathered in the community corner for a final planning meeting. The elderly woman stood up to speak, her voice clear and strong. "A year ago, I was a person who only saw differences," she said. "Now I know that our differences are what make us beautiful, like all the colors in a sunset." As they finished their preparations, the setting sun painted the store in soft golden light. Tomorrow would bring the big celebration, but tonight, in these quiet moments, they could feel the weight of what they'd accomplished. A simple grocery store had become a beacon of hope, showing how communities could heal and grow stronger together. Maria looked around at the faces she'd come to know so well, faces that now told a story of transformation, not just for a store, but for an entire community. What had started with a moment of conflict had blossomed into something beautiful, proving that sometimes the best chapters of our lives begin with the turning of an unexpected page. The lights of Burton's Market dimmed as the last preparations were completed, but the warmth of community it had fostered would continue to glow brightly, lighting the way forward for generations to come.